Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the SimplyTrade podcast. I'm your host, Anik. You're stuck with me for a little while, and my special guest, of course. Thank you for listening. I want to say that firsthand. I always say that at the end, but I feel like maybe I should start saying that in the beginning because you're here now. Again, we're talking about everything trade. Today, we're getting into a special topic, which, it's more about the brokers today and kind of what's going on behind the scenes. But before, I want to touch on some things that happened during this month. So there was a lot of talk, as we have seen for the past months. Section 232 tariffs, they doubled. So they went from 25% to 50% starting June 4th on most imported steel and aluminum. So then we have the US-China trade dispute. So there's been a lot of talks in the US-China region about trade. But you know what? There has not been any changes. It's just been talk. So maybe we'll get this early July, hopefully. And that's really it. So let me introduce my guest, which is why we're all here. So with, the changes that have been happening, the tariffs, trade policies, compliance changes, custom brokers are really on the front lines, I feel, and helping importers really navigate this environment, even though importers still have to be knowledgeable in this field as well. But I thought, who else to best ask than a broker, which I have Brian Barber on here. He's a COEC member, licensed customs broker, and vice president at Wilson International. So I'm very happy to have you here. Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm awesome, Anik. It's great to be back. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. I'm always good. Just rounding up the week. Usually we record on Fridays. Today is Thursday. Yeah. So we talked, oh my God, a few months back, I would have to say. And that was when the tariffs were just coming into effect, I believe. Things have changed since then, I feel. I don't know if it's in a good way or a bad way, but can you kind of lay the groundwork of where you're at and how busy you are or how busy these tariffs are keeping you?
So, it's really been a sprint. Right. It's been quite a sprint for a long, long time, moving into, 3, 4, or 5 months now at this stage in preparation for, administration changes and then just the sweeping changes that we've seen under, IEPA, the 232, the changes in negotiations like you kind of hit on, the changes in rates. There's a lot that's going on, mechanics portion to make all that happen behind the scenes, right? So it's about system readiness. It's about, training, both internally, our employees, and then of course, educating externally, importers and exporters. It has been it's been fraught with change, right? Things are very, very hectic right now.
Yeah. And that is one thing actually I wanted to ask because I always bring this question up, but I feel like I need to ask a broker about this. So when a change is proposed or actually put in place, we get an early announcement, then we get the CSMS messages. And so all that stuff. But when it's actually going into effect, how prepared are you? Like, how much do you have to prepare, especially your team? Because there's so much at stake, right? You have a lot of clients and the clients are expecting you to fulfill, whatever they're asking you to do. But how do you make that happen? Because if things change, you don't even have all the answers at best, right? And you have to get something out the next day. But how do you do that with all these new changes?
Yeah, that's been one of our major challenges, I think, just industry-wide, trade in general. You have a lot of changes that are happening, where you hear something is happening, right? Or that there's going to be a change coming. You can anticipate to some degree, but until you actually see, written guidance, that's where kind of the trickle down effect happens, right? And so I think we're in this environment where we do see, announcements made via social media. And from there, like you said, we're waiting for an executive order to happen. Once we see that executive order, interpretations start. And from there, we'll see a CSMS with guidance. And sometimes that takes time, right? So to your point, how do you effectuate a change when, a lot of times we're getting 7 hours before something actually goes into effect, right? There'll be an announcement, social, it's coming. You don't know exactly what it is. And 7 hours before you get you get an EO, and then we're scrambling to kind of work through and interpret that. So it's very challenging. It's a lot of staying on top of things. We're constantly querying to make sure that the tariff numbers and the changes that we expect to happen are available and ready in ACE. We're constantly, working and reworking communication to client base. We're constantly updating and reworking our training that goes out to our employees as well.
Yeah. And your clients, mostly importers, obviously, right? Or all importers. How are they questioning you, or what? Because I bet there's a lot of questions that come to you, which at this point, I'm sure is putting more work on top of your work that you already have to do for them, because you're kind of being their guidance person in a way as well, understanding what's happening while you're trying to understand what's happening. But what would you tell them, or like how do you even guide them? And it's like one of them, it's not just one client, it's probably all of them.
Yeah. I mean, anytime there is a change, it does certainly light up the hotline, so to speak, right? And so, phones start, email inquiries come in. There is, everyone is trying to understand, and everyone is trying to mitigate what their potential exposure might be, right? So, we're taking a lot of time to work with, importer base, and we're trying to, really get good communications out to customers, right? Once we do have information that is concrete and can really help lay some guidelines and some basically kind of set some boundaries of how this is going to work, how you're going to be impacted. We're running impact assessments, for customers, based on, past history. And we're really trying to put as much information in front of them for them to be able to make good business decisions as things are constantly evolving. But questions range, and every time there's a change, we have to go back and do a lot of research into, okay, when did the entry, when was it key? When did it cross? What was the effective rates at the time of entry? Does it need to be reworked? Now there's potential for some unstacking as well. So each time that there's a change, each time we have to pivot, and each time now we have to work through, whether it's an educational piece or a potential dispute, it's a lot heavier lift to go back and look at all the pieces and, kind of where we were in time when that entry did actually cross or was arrived.
Yeah. Have you seen a lot of scrutiny? I know there's a lot of things going on. I had a Canada episode was it last week? I think it was last week. And I know there's a lot of trouble going on at the border there. Have you noticed anything? Have you been dealing with any of that?
I would definitely say we have seen heightened scrutiny on claims, preferential claims specifically. So what I would say is, U.S. goods returned, or even foreign goods returned, within 3 years. USMCA claims, we are seeing at the port level. We're seeing some enforcement or some requests to, verify or substantiate, country of origin before goods are even entered into commerce. Where typically in the past, that may have been more of a post-entry function. You definitely are seeing some heightened awareness at the ports and some requests prior to even goods being released.
Yeah. What's the biggest scrutiny you see regarding these tariffs and following CBP guidelines? Do you see some companies, well, you're obviously handling it, you're doing it for them, but do you see them trying to get away with things or trying to go around the tariffs? Because I've heard that as well, that when companies deal with China, there's this whole deal having double invoicing. Have you heard about that?
So, I mean, we've heard of it. I mean, it's definitely out there in, I'll say, the universe. Fortunately for my firm, we have not seen that, in practice. Obviously, we are aware of it. As we're working with our importer base, we certainly are communicating to them, if it sounds too good to be true type thing, it likely is. You have to be very careful. CBP has certainly, as we talked about, heightened, scrutiny and enforcement around pieces, and they're getting smarter about how they enforce. Right.
I heard that.
So if you're using a tariff number and have been using a tariff number for the last 20 years, and all of a sudden, you're now changing that tariff number, that's going to get swept up, right? That's going to get swept up by, some algorithm on the CBP side, and it's going to land on someone's desk to essentially validate or ask questions, right? So you have to be very careful about how you make changes. You certainly want to partner with, an industry expert, whether that's someone like us, like a customs broker, potentially a consultant, or even, internal counsel, or potentially trade attorneys, before you make big sweeping changes. There's just too much at stake right now when it comes to setting up business practices, and you want to make sure that you're on the right side before making any large scale changes.
Yeah, I can see that. Also, because I feel like that's another question that we've actually gotten, that I see in the trade, is that sometimes, rules are only in place for like a day or two, and then it changes again. And then people are like, oh, well, I just paid for those, so can I get a refund? Because why did we change for that? Now it's, these 2 days, that's the only time it was in place, the regulation or the tariff. And now the next day it's not, but I did pay for it. And now these other companies don't have to pay for it. So it's unfair, right, to them. Is there such a thing as a tariff refund in that sense, or?
So it depends on how some of the EOs are written, right? So one of the great examples that you kind of hit on right now is when tariffs went into effect originally in March on on Canada and Mexico. Everyone was paying. And that went on for 3 days. And essentially what happened after those 3 days is there became a carve out, for USMCA eligible goods. So you had a lot of importers from Canada and Mexico paying, high rates of duty for just 3 days. And, once the EOs were revised and further guidance came out, stating that, goods that were eligible for USMCA preferential treatment, would not be subject to the additional duties, then that was good news for importers. Now, the bad piece in the back end was there was no ability to claim those, so you couldn't go back and claim that duty that was paid. So that duty wound up being tendered, and we saw some importers have significant duty amounts, up into the seven figures over the course of those 3 days, and those ones were not claimable.
Yeah, what is actually, what I think is a little concerning is that some businesses probably didn't take these tariffs into effect as they went into effect. They said, oh, it's not really happening, or it's only happening for 2 days. So why do I have to pay them? Like, no one's going to look for these tariffs in these 2 days. So when do you think will that show? Because my feelings is that once we're moving forward, right, with all these tariffs, and they're lowering and hiring and changing and whatnot. But when we jump back to the days when there was significant tariffs and someone didn't pay those tariffs, do you think that will come out, or do you think CBP is looking for those companies in specific?
I think, if you're asking, I guess, when we'll start seeing the effect as consumers, I think, we've probably started seeing part of it. I think that's going to continue, the longer tariffs go on, and I think we'll kind of settle into something that I guess is whatever the new normal is going to look like. To your point about, how do you anticipate and how do you predict your costs as you're conducting business? I think that's very challenging, right? We just talked about Canada and Mexico, and no one really anticipated tariffs for those 3 days. Right now, one of the other issues that's going on is there's an interpretation for the on the water provision, right, for goods from overseas. Specifically, China is one of the major ones with, they had, of course, the highest duty rates. And, there's an exemption for on the water. However, there are circumstances in which goods move or were loaded on a vessel and moved, through a feeder port over to a larger port and over to a mother vessel. And, there's a lot of interpretation going on right now of, what should the feeder vessel be allowed? The current guidance from CBP is if it was on the feeder vessel and not the mother vessel, then you would not be eligible for the on the water provision.
So, so there's a lot of things to consider. I feel like here, and it's scary for businesses itself, right? But it's also scary for importers because they're the one. Well, not really scary for importers because you're just doing the work. It comes down on the importer, I feel like, and that's one thing. The importer puts a lot of faith in their broker because they expect them to do it correctly. But obviously, I'm gonna just say there has been some scrutiny because brokers, they're so busy and sometimes there are certain mistakes being, I'm not saying you're making mistakes, but I'm saying there has been situations where the broker can make a little mistake because they have so many clients and obviously there's so many changes. So what do you, for you in your business, what do you tell your importer? Like, do you tell your importer to double check the work or to make sure they understand, or is there like a certain process?
So certainly, I think, importers have always been responsible for their compliance, right? And checking, they should have some audit process of their partners to make sure that the, entries that are going on their behalf are done true and correct, right? Because ultimately, the importer has a reasonable care standard to meet for CBP for their imports. To your point, now more than ever, I think, there are opportunities, for, I'll call them mistakes or errors. Sometimes, really it's difficult to say it's anyone's fault. It's really hard right now. Things are changing so swiftly. So, is software ready? Has guidance been given? Has the guidance changed? Right. There's a lot of pieces that are moving right now to try to get to, I guess, correct entries. And it is very difficult day in and day out to ensure that you've got every single entry. I've kind of used the analogy of, at first we kind of had a fire up top that everyone could see. And we were just trying to get entries moving, get freight moving, kind of keep commerce moving. And now once we've moved into, I guess, a little bit more of a stable environment, we haven't seen the pace of change we saw a couple months ago. Things still are evolving and changing, but it has slowed down a little bit. We're not pivoting or being required to pivot as often as we were several months ago. The fire is now below deck, right? So there were a lot of entries that were kind of swept up into, again, systems issues, lack of guidance issues, changing guidance issues, or, maybe it was just sort of a misunderstanding and information that was required. And so now you have to go back and file post-entry claims, right? So that is going to take a lot of time. I think, what's happened over the course of the last several months is going to take, year and a half, 2 years to sort out, I think, in some cases. Just because the amount of volume that's out there, the amount of monies that are out there, the amount of claims they're going to have to wind up going into CBP, and their workload as well, right? So it's identifying, what might be eligible, or if there is a mistake, or if there was something systemic that happened. It's running the reports to make sure that you're capturing all that. It's filing those claims. It's keeping an eye on dates, right, for liquidation. Are you filing post-summary corrections, or are you filing, protests? If you have to file multiple claims for whatever reason, that can also change your filing timelines, right? Because CBP may liquidate the entry in accelerated fashion, which then ultimately will kind of close your protest window a bit as well. So you have to monitor all these things and make sure that you're tracking to ensure that you've got you've got your claims filed within allowable timeframes.
Seems like that is one of the most important things, and that brings me to a question. Technology, AI is a big thing. It's coming into trade like super hot. We see so many AI companies kind of tracking down on trade, trying to make it easier and more secure to your supply chains. How is that for brokers? Are you able to use some of these AI tools, or is there something that you can use, or is there technology that makes things easier for you? Do you have any tips on that?
So I think right now there is a huge appetite to automate, right? I'd say generally speaking, a lot of the automation that we had in place before, whether it was EDI feeds or integrated feeds, with importers, because of the stacking, because of all the additional requirements, all the additional data, some of that's been broken, right? And you have to be able to use logic and leverage technology to be able to, keep pace with the amount of data that's now being required to be transmitting. I think, ML, AI, there's a place for it, right? There are circumstances where I think it makes sense to leverage those utilities. I think the first step really is to restore connectivity that we had within the industry, because I think some of that still is fractured a bit. But, when you're looking at things like, classifications, and when you're looking at things like trying to run reports and sort of sweep up things into workflows that might be eligible, for some type of refund, I think that's a great opportunity to leverage AI there. You're putting parameters in, you're helping it learn. Of course, you got to keep that human in the loop, right? We all know that. AI, while it's an awesome tool and while it can certainly help you be a lot more productive, you have to make sure you have those stopgaps in place to make sure a human is actually overseeing that machine operator, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. That's perfect. So what opportunity, okay, this is kind of my last question, but what opportunities do you see for brokers and importers this year? Like, do you see maybe a positive out of all these challenges that are being thrown at you?
There's always, no. There's always opportunities and there's always challenges, right? As far as for opportunities for brokers, I think, there's refund recovery services, right? As we've talked about, that's going to be in high demand for the foreseeable future, just due to the nature of stacking rules, changes, unstacking now. I think, there's supply chain restructuring, it's prompting importers to seek new sourcing strategies. That could provide some opportunities for brokers to, in an advisory capacity. I think, optimizing trade agreements, USMCA, we've talked about a little bit right now or a little bit earlier. That's a hot topic, right? Goods that are eligible for USMCA currently are not subject to tariffs. Right. So, the USMCA helps there. There are importers before that might have had a low duty rate, 1-2%. It wasn't worth going through all of the, fundamental record keeping to, ensure that it was USMCA compliant. So maybe they didn't claim USMCA before, but now it's a much bigger topic. It's a much bigger dollar spend if you're not certifying for USMCA. So I think that's an opportunity there, right? When you get into consulting and just looking at free trade agreements. And again, I think, adopting technology. I think, right now there's a huge appetite for automation. We say that all the time internally. We have benefited for quite some time, integrating with our customer base, right, as an industry. And I think, with the data stacking and the data changes, it's breaking some of that. So we've got to get back to basics on that, restore that connectivity. We've got to provide, meaningful self-serve operations or self-serve options to our customer bases. And I think, it's an opportunity to expand our ML and AI footprints. What are you doing currently with AI? I find a lot of times when you have the initial discussions with AI vendors, it's very much, to start from scratch, right? You have to build it. What are your problems? What are you trying to solve? And I think we've got a lot of interesting, problems right now, or challenges that require solutions. So now really is the time to sort of dig into that, and see where you think you can leverage AI. I mean, for a long time, you've talked earlier about vendors and we've seen a lot more of them around in the industry space. Classification has been a place where I think AI has been leveraged for some time. Again, make sure you keep that human in the loop. I mean, I've gone out and done a couple of experiments where I've taken, the same description and I've ran it through 3 or 4 AI tools and I've gotten slightly different information, right? I've got some that'll go to 6 digits. I've got some that'll go to 10. The 10-digit ones may be different. I've seen scenarios where some will say, hey, consult a customs expert to be sure. Some don't, right? So again, as the importer, you're responsible for, the data that is transmitted to CBP. As a broker, we're subject to responsible supervision and control, right? So make sure you're meeting those standards. So AI, ML is going to be great tools for us in the future. Got to keep that human in the loop, and you just got to make sure that, you're just not letting it run free.
Yeah. And I love that. I kind of want to end on that, going back to the basics. I think in all kind of situations in life, that's always good because you kind of, and it can help you find other loopholes, where you're like, oh, why did we even go this route before, when we have another route that we can go, or like something easier for us, or just easier tools, or, kind of getting more help. I don't know, but basics is always a great way to start. And if that is an opportunity during this season, I would say, of life, in trade, then that's something good out of it, I feel. And maybe that'll make your business more efficient at the end of the day. So I think that's probably the best way. And I want to thank you so much for coming on and kind of giving your expertise in the background of what's going on behind the tariffs and behind the regulations and policies that have been changing day and night, I would say, and are continuously changing. And that is really all I have for you. Do you have any last remarks?
Real quick before we end, I kind of want to throw out a couple things that I would say would be great as far as top advice right now. A couple things that I've been thinking about quite a bit internally, and what we're talking about a lot to our importer base is now more than ever, what you put on your paperwork matters, right? So I think in the past, dollar amounts may not have been, or high dollar amounts may not have been in play. If you are using a special provision, be very clear about what that special provision is. When you have vague things on there, or vague things on paperwork, for example, something like, hey, not a sale, what does that actually mean, right? Is it supposed to be, a temporary import? Is it going for processing? If you don't clarify that, it can lead to either additional questions or maybe even unwanted interpretations, which certainly can cost a lot of money, right? If it's not done properly, which then again puts you back into this whole post-entry component that we've talked about. And the other thing I'd say just real quick is, you want to engage in transparent partnerships. I think right now, providing your broker and other trusted advisory partners with a full scope of what you're doing or what your scenario is, it's always going to lead to the best advice. And I think, a lot of times, there have been scenarios where maybe you don't have a full description, you don't have technical literature, providing detail about what's happening, your sourcing, bill of materials, all those things go into getting quality advice, and again, contributing to your compliance and your responsible supervision control as a broker, or your reasonable care standard as an importer.
Yeah, I actually really like that communication. Oh my God. I've seen it in country of origin, in all the supply chains, country of origin and what there is. It's kind of scary to see what the outcome can be if you're not transparent and if you're trying to, find loopholes in those kind of areas, especially right now. Ooh, probably wouldn't want to do that. But thank you so much. No, I think that's great advice. And to our listeners, if you have any questions or if you need more answers or if anything really at all, please reach out to me or reach out to Brian. I'm sure he's very busy, but if you reach out to me, I'll reach out to him and we'll see how we can help you. I think the trade community needs to stick together, especially if we can, bring information across this way, which is not a very serious way, but kind of a fun way, I would say. I mean, it's fun to me. So, anyways, thank you for listening. And next week, actually, which is great, we talked about AI. Next week, we will have, which will be 4th of July, actually, after the Monday after will be an AI episode. So pretty interesting stuff, kind of goes hand in hand with this, and I'm excited for it. So thank you again, Brian, for bringing your expertise on the SimplyTrade podcast. Always thankful. And to the listeners, we will see you next week. So have a great week.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or You can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.